Now that the schoolmaster is abroad, there can be no question that the warm sun of education will, in the course of a very few years, dissipate those vapors of superstition, whose wild and shadowy forms have from time immemorial thrown a mysterious mantle around our mountain summits, shed a darker horror through our deepest glens, traced some legendary tale on each unchiseled column of stone that rises on our bleakest hills, and peopled the green border of the wizard stream, and sainted well with beings of a spiritual world. While, however, the Friends of Ireland cannot but be pleased in thinking that our peasantry should, from being better informed, renounce their belief in these idle tales of superstition to which they, unfortunately, have for centuries been taught to listen with delight, to the exclusion of matters more rational and more important. It is to be hoped that the two prominent features of our antiquity as a nation will not be altogether lost sight of, namely, our vernacular language and those extraordinary tales, those extraordinary legends, which are esteemed by many as going a great length to prove, from their remarkable analogy with the tales of the Eastern world, our Oriental descent. Although the good people still retain a most respectable footing, a peasant may now travel from Cape Clear to Connemara without encountering that once dreaded personage, a ghost. Even the Pooka, or Irish goblin, has not for the last 40 years, as far as our recollection serves, been known to shake the dripping ooze from his hairy hide, to approach the haunts of men, or to practice, by the conscious light of the moon, like the fairies and satyrs of heathen mythology, any of those unlucky tricks upon his mortal neighbours, for which he was at one period so much dreaded in many portions of our island. The Pooka is described as a frisky, mischievous being, having such a turn for roguish fun, as to induce him to be all night in wait for the carrow to returning over the moor from the pleasures of the card table, or for the frequenter of wakes. His usual appearance was that of a sturdy pony with a shaggy hide. He generally lay couched like a cat in the pathway of the unfortunate pedestrian. Then, starting between his legs, he hoisted the unlucky wretch aloft on his crupper, from which no shin-breaking rushings by stone walls, no furious driving through white-thorn hedges, or life-shaking plunges down cliff and quagmire could unseat him. The first crowing of the March cock respited the sorrowful rider, who generally ended this dear-bought tour by a tremendous fling from the Pooka's back into some deep bog-hole or thorny brake, where 10,000 prickles reared their points to drink the blood of his bruised and broken flesh. On the other hand, he is reported to commiserate the lot of the benighted traveller, and there are some instances on record of his having gently trotted beneath the wayfaring cottager for many a mile, to the neighbourhood of the well-remembered cabin on the heath. Fea Pooka, in the county of Kerry, was, as its name imports, the haunt of one of those imaginary monsters. This Fea, or marsh, belonged to Tim Dorney, a snug farmer whose ancestors for many years occupied the adjacent farm, and who honest men in that golden age never found it necessary to disturb the goblin in the favourite haunt by reclaiming his dreary abode. But when the farm which his grandfather tilled came into Tim Dorney's occupation, a taste for improvement and the necessary expenditure of a large and increasing family induced him to cross-cut Fea Pooka by drains and ditches. And 2 summers had hardly passed when this haunt of the wild goose and the dark, mischievous goblin afforded a heavy sward of hay and firm footing for man and beast. The Pooka, thus beaten up and driven from the marsh, naturally turned his thoughts to the meditation of revenge on him who with profane hand rent asunder that sacred veil which the superstition of ages had woven round the dreaded spot. Tim was a painstaking, industrious peasant, and accustomed to traverse his farm every night to ascertain that no neighbouring cattle trespassed on his ground. One night, as he returned along the border of the marsh, he saw something shaped like a dark-coloured, long-tailed pony lie in the narrow way, directly across his path. and before he could slip aside, to shun the lurking apparition, the Pooka, for it was he, suddenly started between the legs of the terrified farmer and bore him off the ground. The goblin rushed along with the speed of the whirlwind, and Tim's first moment of reflection was employed in a fruitless attempt to fling himself to the ground, but he found that some invisible hand had bound him to the back of his supernatural enemy. It would be tedious to recount the hard rubbings against stone walls and the wild rushings through quickset hedges that Tim Doherty endured, while the rapidity of his flight completely deprived him of breath and utterance. At last, they rushed towards a tall cliff, which frowned in horrid gloom above the deep river, and intercepted by its giant bulk the yellow light of the moon that gilt the mountain tops, quivered in the rustling foliage of the trees, and, brightening in its advance, burnished the trembling waters with liquid fire. The Pooka pushed with unabated speed to the edge of the rock, then suddenly stopped, as if to add to the death pang of his agonized victim, by a previous view of the fearful height and the dark waves that curled among the pointed rocks below. Tim Doherty, now concluding that all of his life would be ended for him in the next plunge, yelled a shriek of unutterable dismay. The tall cliff returned the piercing sound, which, with the scream of the startled wildfowl and the demon voice of the Pooka, that combined the mockery of human laughter with a wild, indescribable howl, blended in horrid unison along the lonely glen. Whether the Pooka was satisfied with thus inflicting the pangs of a frightful death by anticipation, or that he possessed no power over human life, does not appear. But, in the next moment, he started from the fearful cliff, and returning through the deep ravines and tangled underwood, to a Furtzbrake that skirted the border of a standing pool, plunged his unfortunate rider among the sharp bushes. Happy in his deliverance, he heard the troubled waters of the dark pool resound to the plunge of the returning Pooka, beheld his uncouth figure glance darkly along the moor, till the lessening form grew dimly faint in the moonshine, and the hurried splashing of his rapid hoof broke the silence of the night no more. Tim, as may naturally be supposed, made the best of his way to the cottage, and being of true Milesian origin, determined on having his revenge upon his fiendish enemy. It was a fine night in the month of August, when Tim Doherty, having sufficiently recruited himself after his adventure of wild horsemanship, walked forth, like him that hath his quarrel just, doubly armed. His heels were furnished with a pair of long-necked spurs that bore rowels contrived at the next forge, which could goad a rhinoceros to death. His hand wielded a leaden whip, so called from the handle being set with lead, and in the grasp of a strong man was capable of felling an ox. He whistled as he went, not for want of thought, for his mind was brooding over a plan to revenge against the Pooka, who, according to his usual habit, started between the farmer's legs and bore him off. Tim, nothing loth of the abduction, just when the Pooka was commencing his antics, twisted the lash of the whip around his hand, and leveled such blows about the goblin's ears as would have crushed any skull made of mortal penetrable stuff, while the sharp-roweled spurs gave ample revenge for the pointed insults of the preceding night. Dire were the tossings, deep the groans of the Pooka during this unmerciful ride, but Tim Doherty clung to him like a monkey until the Pooka lay down, outmastered by his mortal antagonist. Next night, Tim walked abroad in quest of his acquaintance. He whistled his favorite air of Tamahula to lull the suspicions of the latter, who held aloof, quite on his guard, eyeing the other from his lurking place, and breaking his usual taciturnity by asking in an uncouth voice the well-remembered question, "Will Nagaranuth? Have you sharp things on?" Some years had now rolled their seasons round, and the Pooka seemed to have entirely forgotten his antagonist and his ancient dwelling of the marsh, when Tim Dorney had occasion to visit a gossip sister's cousin's brother-in-law, who had lately come home after an absence of 25 years on board a man-of-war. The credit side of the account sheet of the seaman's life was fraught with a copious list of wonders, all his travels history, and a pension of 9 pence a day. On the debtor side stood the loss of the right arm, the closing of his starboard eye, and sundry minor details received in the duty of boarding and cutting out, with occasional tavern scuffles. Tim was highly delighted at the tough yarn of his old acquaintance, heard with gaping wonderment the recital of a battle with a French 74 off the island of Elba, where the relator lost his precious arm, an encounter with a Sally rover which they sent down to Old Davy, and a dreadful storm near the island of Malta, of voyages along the coast of Tunis, where the people are all musicianers, by Tripoli, famous for its wrestlers, and a journey through the desert of Barca, when the inhabitants, men and women, have dogs' heads. The ale of a neighbouring shebeen greatly improved the sailor's turn for narration, and though the rain poured in torrents through the grass-grown roof of the cabin, yet the night flew on with songs and clatter, and aye the ale was growing better. But Tim, being retained that night to form one of a party that had engaged to play at cards for 200 of herrings, and as he was a famous carou, could not disappoint his friends, who mainly depended on Tim's address to carry off the wager. The rain had now ceased, and after grasping the sailor's hand and requesting his company on a given night at Pooka, he departed. The moon, yet obscured by heavy clouds, cast a sad and sickly gleam upon his path, which, winding round a precipitous descent, led into the bosom of a deep glen, where the turbid mountain torrents had swelled into muddy waves the clear and beautiful brook, that erewhile had bubbled with soothing murmurs along the yellow pebbles. There was no sound on the hill save the plaintive howl of the watchdog, baying the broad round moon. The night wind slightly shook the thin foliage of the decaying wood that surmounted the steep sides of the glen, and the hoarse, hollow sound of the roaring river, that would seem to a fanciful ear the boding voice of the water fairy, echoed along the distant banks. Though Tim Dorney's education had taught him to people the loneliest scenes with beings of another life, yet he passed unappalled to the brink of the torrent, and sighed to behold that the force of the stream left him little chance of crossing over with safety. While he loitered along the bank, he was agreeably surprised to behold in a little cove, which led into a ford, a small horse, resembling a Kerry pony. He was tied by a halter, had a peleen sousa, or straw saddle, on his back, and to one of the foldings of the straw saddle was stuck a whitethorn plant. Tim, grateful for this favorable opportunity of moving homeward, had already his leg raised to mount, when the titter of suppressed laughter behind a crag shook his heart with terror and excited his suspicion of the pony. He had not meddled with the whitethorn stick, for he rarely went abroad by day or night unprovided with a choice of hazel sapling. This miraculous plant, against which nothing evil can contend, well served this time of need, for, retiring a little, Tim Dorney bestowed so hearty a salute on the guileful Pooka, for it was he, that the laughter sounds were changed into a wild howl, and as the Pooka disappeared along the troubled stream, the dashing waters deluged the sounding banks. But a time arrived when the persevering goblin wreaked cruel revenge on his hitherto fortunate adversary. It was approaching the 25th of March, when the farmers usually pay the rent, and Tim, who was extremely punctual in the payment of the half-year's gale, prepared to send a quantity of the last season's butter to Cork for that purpose. Wheel carriages were then totally unknown in that part of the country. The sliding car, indebted to no wheels, glided in the vicinity of the farms, while burdens were conveyed to more remote places on the backs of horses. 5 or 6 neighbours at this time were setting off to transmit the produce of the dairy to Cork, and Tim, with 4 stunted nags that usually ran wild and free on the mountains, fell into their company. Each little horse was generally laden with 2 full, and on and on and on and on. In the evening, the caravan came within view of Blarney Castle, while the last rays of the declining sun tinged its ivied turrets with golden hue. As the night breeze blew keen and fierce, our travellers halted at a small public house on the road to repel its chilling influence by a glass of spirits. Their delay was hardly for a minute, and they hastened to overtake the horses that moved at a slow pace before them. But suddenly, some strange disorder began to prevail among the animals. Some fled terrified along the road. Others ran across the open common that extended to the right, and Tim Dorney's train particularly were observed to reach a fearful and perpendicular descent from whose edge the road lay about 20 yards. Their terrified owner uttered a shriek of dread and despair when he beheld the misshapen hairy Pooka urge his cattle to the steep cliff. It was only the work of a moment. They rushed as if by an irresistible impulse to the fatal brink, and, tumbling headlong, one instant beheld their shattered, lifeless carcasses strew the bottom of the stream-worn ravine. The pointed rocks below staved the butter casks to pieces, and their contents were wholly lost. This was but the commencement of a train of misfortune to Tim Dorney. He was finally ejected from his snug, well-improved farm. Faya Pooka, that had been in the occupation of his family for 150 years before, passed into the hands of strangers, and the descendants of Tim Dorney are homeless wanderers upon the earth. And such is the account which at this day is given by the remaining members of the family of the commencement of their misfortunes.